Dr. Ann Clark is a behavioral ecologist at Binghamton University. She is broadly interested in the evolution and ecology of animal social behavior. Tonight, she will introduce us to the complex world of American crows, based on a 30-year study of one population in Ithaca, New York. She will also extend her discussion to crow species globally. We are grateful to Dr. Clark and look forward to learning from an expert. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great. As I show my slides, you probably will be aware I don't actually see anybody and I can't see the chat. So I will be giving this to myself and my computer, and I will hopefully rejoin you to find out what questions you've had. I think Susan will interrupt me as best she can if there's some problem that I can't see. So I hope you do accumulate your questions as you go. And I'm going to begin then sharing my screen. We'll get one quick look at my non-screen. All right, now let me go to slideshow. And I will go fairly fast because most of it's pictures. So if we can always go back to a slide. Okay, so starting right out with the title slide of this, what I want to emphasize is how crows have moved in with us and what we do and don't know about what that means for their own health and well-being. Whoops. Let's see if I can get this to advance. Come on. Wait a minute. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with an advance here, which I don't usually have. Okay. So let me move some windows around here because I can't actually see my own slides very well. There we go. Yeah, so first of all, as a behavioral ecologist, I think of crows and many animals as the possible subjects of study. And for crows, I'm particularly interested because in many ways, they fulfill what I think we want as model organisms. That is, organisms from whom we can learn lessons that will pertain to lots of other organisms. And as a behavioral ecologist, as Becky mentioned, I'm particularly interested in how and when complex cooperative social systems actually evolve, and also how those conditions lead to complex to cognitive skills. I'm not sure what is going on here. Sorry.
Have you tried using arrow keys on your keyboard?
That's what I'm using,
okay.
Actually. And I'm not quite sure. I just keep hitting something that keeps going. I think it's actually, yeah, I'm getting little blips and then all of a sudden it'll move. So
interesting. Do you want to stop share and try to reshare?
I can't do anything at the moment.
Okay.
This is giving me okay, I got it. Okay, I think I can do this. It wants to use my, yeah, let me stop this and go back to the beginning. It wants to use something that I am not familiar with having it do, but that's all right. We'll go. All right. Okay, let's get back to model organisms. And the other aspect of crows is that they've adapted to us and living in their cities. They make another excellent model organism. As we try to ask what traits that make animals good urban adapters, what are the common traits of animals that have successfully moved into our cities? As a behavioral ecologist, when I look at cities with some horror, Many of us, myself included, look at that and go, I'm not living there. It looks like a pretty bad thing for me. On the other hand, as a behavioral ecologist, all of a sudden, cities becoming so widespread and animals moving into them offers an incredible opportunity to study exactly how animals and plants and other organisms adapt to their new conditions. And birds have already stood out as key players in our understanding of urban adaptations. Many of you have, of course, pigeons, everybody knows pigeons, and great tits and their other paired relatives in Europe have become really interesting, important ways to understand how birds have adapted to cities. And what I'd like to do is argue that we can add our American crows and other crows potentially to that list. So what exactly does make a good urban adapter? People who study urban adapting animals have tried to differentiate urban avoiders. Those are the ones who just never show up. The moment you cut down the forest, they're never back again. From the exploiters like pigeons, who are so incredibly embedded in our city cultures, and they are so embedded in terms of their own lifestyles that they move with cities across the world, to the ones who more recently or more dynamically move in and adapt. And we think of a number of things that makes a good adapter. There are ecological aspects, a broad diet, some degree of flexibility and nest sites. Also, and very interestingly, behavioral traits like flexibility, ability to innovate and learn from each other, so that every bird who moves into the city doesn't have to learn all by themselves. They can learn from each other if somebody makes an innovation. And in many ways, people have emphasized that moving in with people and a scary, loud, noisy city may take some degree of difference in personality, not your average personality. Perhaps the bolder individuals move in, or once you're in there, it's the bolder individuals who do better. We'll come back to that. And then from an evolutionary biologist, we need some time if we expect genetic change. Crows and ravens certainly fulfill the personality, innovation, flexibility aspect. And we have numerous papers over the last 10, 15, 20 years to emphasize that crows and ravens worldwide have become so well known for their intelligence that people now call them feathered apes. Our American crow, in many ways, seems well set up to have moved into cities. They're a very widespread bird, as you all can appreciate. They live in all kinds of climates and have adapted very broadly to many different kinds of habitat conditions where they nest varies hugely, and they are capable of long movements to get food, so well set up. And in fact, not only are they set up from the ecological point of view, but they've, as John Marsliff out in Washington has argued, they've long been synanthropic, that is, living with people. Probably from our indigenous peoples, crows were right there to help them out with their garbage, their kills, their leftovers. But only recently, and surprisingly, very recently, have they become actual urban adapters. And here's a study from the Breeding Bird Survey, which shows you what has happened to crow populations across the 60s up to almost the current day, as during that time, the crows have moved into the city. Once they've moved in, it seems to have been great for populations. I'm not going to talk about West Nile virus today, but in case you're interested, that little drop at the end, right around just before and through 2001, is the effects of West Nile virus on crow populations. My colleague, who many of you will know, Kevin McGowan, went back every year to where he grew up in Springfield, Ohio. And when he would go back, he would always record many birds, not just crows. And then he made this graph of the crows he found there when he went back in December for Christmas. And it really illustrates the way crows have moved into cities of all sizes. Back in the early 70s, he barely saw any. By the time you get into the mid 80s, they're well established, and crows are a general feature of the environment. So why have crows moved in? Well, we recognize a number of possible reasons. I can't say that we have any single smoking gun. That's a bad thing to say. First of all, they're stable human food sources. If they're very Catholic and broad in their diets, then we offer lots of opportunities. Second, and very importantly, there's now no hunting in the city. Most of you know that in the early 70s, we have the Migratory Bird Act. And not only was there no hunting in front of somebody's house probably before that, but hunting became a matter of control, and many birds couldn't be hunted anymore. Crows, unfortunately, are still hunted, but it's limited, and it usually happens only in rural areas. That's our New York DEC hunting rules, in case you want to hunt crows. But it doesn't happen in the city. So come in the city, nobody's going to lift a gun at you. And at least during the early years, there were fewer predators. Ecologically, it's a dietary and habitat generalist. So it's well set up to adapt its diet to find food and find nesting sites in a changed environment around people. Also, they amply show, as many people complain about, how behaviorally flexible and innovative they are in getting that food, and their ability to open things up, to learn our garbage routes, to learn the garbage days, to be willing to drop down inside dumpsters, really attests to their ability to adapt. So some of the questions that we've been interested in is, how does an urban environment really challenge a crow? What are the positives and negatives? And with respect to personality, I and some of my graduate students have been asked, what really is novel through their eyes, through a crow looking at their environment? And how much have they changed and adapted from their rural counterparts? So the Crow Research Group has followed now individually marked crows for about 50% of the time that crows have lived in the cities, if you stop and think about it. If they came in the 60s and 70s, in 1989, Kevin established this marked population in urban, and I'm going to call Ithaca urban, even though it's really suburban most of the time. And to some extent, marked crows also in the rural surround of Ithaca. In 2001, I and my students joined, and here we are 33 years after he started it. With 33 years, that's almost 50% of the total time that crows have been in cities. So I'm going to quickly talk then about crow social systems in the city and to some extent out. I'll try to make it, you can ask about how it may differ. Then we'll talk a little bit about their dietary choices in the cities and adaptive challenges that they may face there. And then I want to talk a little bit about behavioral change. In what ways can we judge that crows have really adapted to us? And I'll talk about mobbing, and I'll talk about also this concept of boldness. And finally, I'll end with a bid to conserve crows worldwide and try to point out that because we know American crows, I think we take them for granted that they're wildly successful, adaptable, not really something to worry about. But if we start to think about crows worldwide, I think you'll see that there's a real problem. So first of all, studying crows is unusual, and it's unusual partly because crows are hard to study. We want to put bands on them, we want to weigh them and measure them and get to know them. Trapping adults is really hard. These crows have had 2 weeks with being fed in front of that net. and we moved something that morning that we were going to shoot, and you can see exactly how they react. They're as suspicious as ever. So most of our trapping and our banding and tagging is actually done of nestlings, and we have to find nests, which in Ithaca are high in trees, and then you have to get to those nests. In the nests, obviously, the eggs nestlings are much less likely to be suspicious of you and try to fly away. So that's nice. But the trees can be truly amazingly high, and they love big, tall, white pines that are brittle and whose branches are easy to break. And these are two pictures of Kevin going up to two separate big white pines. I've got a picture of me. I have gone up very few trees next to Kevin, who's literally climbed thousands. Now we have Mark Holton over at Cornell, who teaches tree climbing, and he and his students have been climbing for us. And of course, when we get up there, this is probably our one chance to have them in hand. We pop them in a bucket, come down on to the ground as quickly as possible. We weigh, we measure, we take blood samples, we put on these cute little tags. I will say our green tag that year got a little bit big. I have been reducing tag size, each one with a unique number. And then once they've been fully, quote, processed and photographed and looked at and admired, we pop them back in their nests until they, and wait for them to fledge. And as I say, the only time we will guaranteed to have them in hand. And the point of all this, netting and capturing and whatnot, is that we want to be able to recognize and follow the lives of these individual crows. So each one receives a unique set of color bands that both tells us something about the year, but also identifies the individual, as well as a color tag or two tags that reflect both the year and a unique number. Well, unique, because now with over 3,000 crows banded and tagged, we've gone through every single letter, number combination 3 times. So let's talk a little bit about their social system as we understand it, having followed all of these banded birds. American crows in the Northeast, and I'll say the Northeast because they're not the same in every place. In some places, they're recorded only to breed in pairs. But in our American crows in the Northeast, they defend family territories year-round. And they also leave those territories regularly for communal foraging and roosting off territory. So very much like us, and we always stress how much they're really like us, they have their house, their porch, and all of that, and then they'll go to the mall, and they'll go to the store, and they'll even go to the motel. Some of them at this latitude migrate. And in New York State, they may leave, but not migrate really north or south. They may leave home, leaving their territories, and move around with large flocks of more northern crows that have moved down. And people think they've migrated, but they may be actually east or west or, northeast of you, or roosting up in Auburn and using the fields. The really impressive thing about crows, particularly in the Northeast, is that they're cooperative breeders. Many year-old birds stay home. They don't leave. They don't become yearling flocks like ravens do, but they stay home and actually help rear the next year's young and help generally with the family. So on your left in this picture, at least on my left, there is, you can see UK and QO looking into a nest. The mother is toward the back, and they're looking at newly hatched nestlings, which you can just see. Those two, QO and UK, are they're just yearlings from last year. And they were really, really excited about these new babies. And if you look down to the little picture at the right, you can see one of our very large families where the different colors of tags reflect that we have like 2 or 3 years of offspring still retained with the family. Cooperative breeders are a very select group of birds. This picture has devolved over the years, I can see. But the cooperators, the younger non-breeding birds, and sometimes birds that join from outside the family, act as feeders of the young. They act as sentinels, both at the nest and when the family is foraging. They act as territory defenders, and they are often social tutors, where the youngsters follow them around as they learn to forage. If you think about it, there's a good deal of potential advantages in having a mixed age group. Your family, I think many human families think of their middle to older offspring as good caretakers, and that's true. But even in a more subtle way, one of my students, Jen Campbell-Smith, did her PhD dissertation looking at the responses of crows to opportunities to explore non-food objects and to open containers, and whether they watched each other. One of the things that she discovered was that the juvenile crows, the youngsters 2, 3, 4, 5 months out of the nest, they were the ones who were very likely to pick up non-food objects. Adult crows, as you can see in this graph at the far right under adult, they just never did. They just didn't pick up something that wasn't food. They already knew what food was, and they were not going to waste their time. The guys in between, the yearlings and the 2-year-olds, if they weren't breeding, were less likely than the juveniles, but still occasionally picked up these objects. Furthermore, once they picked them up, the juveniles were kind of ADHD and would often just put them down. But the yearlings and the subadults, if they picked them up, would often explore them for a considerable amount of time. And it was, in fact, everybody 3 years and under that was likely to actually explore new, possible, interesting things. So as I say, discovery favors the young and curious, and that could be passed on to their family. Crows live a long time, and many of you may be aware of a very, very, very ancient American crow that was in captivity and died in his 50s. But we have old crows even in the wild, and our crows really are wild. They're totally free and on their own. We've had 3 males live to age 19. This is AP, who actually died having lost all his bands. And I could actually, for his last few months, I could tell him, because if I took a picture, I could get a shadow of his cataracts in his eyes. MP Jessup, one of my very favorite crows, lived to 19. And she was breeding in her 19th year and nesting. And if anybody wants to know about crows and merlins, I don't have that in here, but you can ask me about that. The reason that she lost that nest had to do with merlins. Okay, some quickie on urban-rural contrasts. These are Northeast crows, but in the rural areas, the territories are much less well-defined and they're much larger. So urban territories tend to be only 1/5 of the size of rural territories. Urban nests in Ithaca, at least, are higher. They choose these huge, tall trees that many of us have nurtured in our backyards. And they maintain much larger family groups. And it appears that the rural crows, the family groups don't stay nearly, the yearlings don't stay nearly as long and may not even help. So how do you become a breeder in a complex social structure like this, hanging out with your family and not breeding and helping? Well, first of all, crows not only live a long time, but they take a long time to grow up. So this is all calculated before West Nile. We now have younger breeders more often, I think. But for the pre-West Nile years, males often didn't breed until they were between 4 and 5 years old. The actual average is right about 4.5. For females, it's about 3.5. So that's a long time to wait in order to breed. How you breed how you get to breed is different for males and females. For males, what we find is that most often they inherit their actual territory. They take over from their father or their brother or uncle, whoever was the breeding male, and become the breeder. We can talk about that a little later. The other opportunity is that they find a mate and they actually establish a new territory. That actually falls under both new and budding. Budding is where a young male will get a mate, establish a territory in overlapping with his family territory. He may actually get help from his family in defending that new territory and expanding it into some other family's territory. And then he may also replace a male who has disappeared or died. And very seldom do males join other families, probably from resistance from the breeding male. Females, however, have a rather different situation. Again, what we discovered more recently with West Nile virus is that females will also bud. They will also establish a territory right next to their family and sometimes get family help in doing so. They may also inherit from their mother. But perhaps the most often thing that happens for them is replacing a female who has died or disappeared. And one of the reasons that happens is that females are much, much more prone to be killed during nesting as they sit on the nest. They're more susceptible, particularly to owls and other raptors on the nest. In general, females seem to disappear and not live as long as males. So this is a highly cooperative society with lots of helping, lots of participation in almost every aspect of group life, foraging. They don't fight on territory with each other to any degree. You can sometimes create a little scuffle, but it's unlikely. But under all that, there's also competition. This is, after all, evolutionary selection favoring those who actually end up breeding. And one of the things we've seen now, increasingly we have large numbers, is actual fights for a breeding female. And those fights can start within the family. So this is a real quick one example. Brother XX, who is, he has a pink tag, and I don't think you're able to see it in these pictures, but XX moved finally away from his natal family at the age of 10, which is pretty delayed to have stuck with his family that long. And by that time, he and his father were not happy with each other. And his mother had died, and there was a stepmother. So there's lots of reasons there. But in any case, he moved and found a female, established a new territory, and his 4-year-old brother, Adar, went with him. And that lasted for about a year and a half. They lost the first brood. And the next spring, Adar made his move. And Adar and XX, you can see the fight there. What it ended with, the female was watching the whole time and calling. And the only thing that stopped this fight that I could see was that the neighbors arrived. And as soon as the neighbors arrived, both of them flew up and went after the neighbors. But the next day, I went looking for them, couldn't find anybody. There may have been more fights. 6 days later, I finally found XX again. He was on a little piece of his territory still, but you can tell by how he's sitting. He was just one bedraggled bird, and it looked like he may have been injured around the head. I crossed the road to see the rest of the territory, and sure enough, Adar and the female were over there. So it appeared over the next 2 weeks that XX must have been injured. He never looked any better, and then he finally disappeared. People often ask us, do crows kill each other? And for a long time, I think we would have said, oh, no. People have misinterpreted things. But now we have actually got evidence of 2 such cases in which competition on the family territory has led to murder. There's a fairly specific situation, but I will just quickly give you one example, not the most complicated one. So 00 Jewel 03, he was actually the remaining crow in a family that lost all but 2 individuals during West Nile virus. And he stayed with probably his uncle, as his uncle established a new territory with a female that was nearby. And that the next year, so in 07, he actually tried to establish a territory next to his uncle, had a huge fight. After doing so, then had a huge fight with another male over a female who came in. His leg was badly injured and dangling, and ultimately he lost the leg and foot. Soon after that, he took a new territory a little farther over from his uncle, so that he wasn't in any sort of direct competition with anyone, and attracted a mate. So you can get a mate even if you have a stump leg. And he was joined at that time by his nephew, whom he helped raise in 2008. And they spent the first year attempting to rear young and failing. And then in 2009, is that right? I got a call from the sheriff's office that we had a dead crow on the ground outside their office, and that was right where his territory was. So I was quite sure who that might be. And sure enough, 2010, he was on the ground outside the office. And moreover, what you notice is that he's not been killed very expertly. Somebody just hammered away at his head. The actual cause of death was obviously a crow fight, but why didn't he just fly away? Well, as far as we can tell, that side of his head, got trapped on the side with his bad leg down, so he couldn't push up like the other birds were doing when they catch each other's feet, and got trapped on the ground, and presumably DL just kept on hammering. So here you can see how he would have gotten trapped. As short as that leg was, he had no way to push off. And finally, of course, there's even more subtle competition. Some of that needs paternity tests to resolve. So we've done paternity analyses. Andrea Townsend in particular got her dissertation looking at the paternity patterns and inbreeding in our crows. And she did discover that we have a certain percentage of the offspring are not fathered by the male, who is the social mate of the female. So here you see a diagram. If you look on the one underneath the crow, one of the most common cases within the family is that you have the son of a father who has now got a stepmother to the son. So the son's mother has died, and his stepmother, not related to him, is in the family, and there's competition to try to mate with her by an adult, a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old male who's still home cooperating with his dad. The most common is from an outside male, and only sometimes do we know who those males are. And then in 2 cases, we had actual incest in which a son had mated with his mother. So these things happen in terms of heavy-duty cooperation, competition for matings, where your dad can live 19 years. What are you going to do? Well, some of this business of mating with related individuals may contribute to the inbreeding. even more so, males tend not to leave home and females may not go very far. So even without incest, you may be mating with relatively close relatives. And one of the things that we've found with our crows is they indeed suffer a great number of odd infections. The little scrawny nestling down there is not infected, by the way. He and all his siblings, for a number of years, that pair would produce these nestlings who had primaries and tail feathers, but not any good adequate body feathers. And then after the first juvenile molt, they looked fine. So we think it was, again, a case of inbreeding. There are diseases that these are mosquito transmitted, and they often are very benign little pox and then it heals, but in some cases it gets really horrible and actually kills a bird, as it did in the case of WT. And Andrea did some work looking at this causes of death and whether or not inbreeding was associated with any particular cause of death. And in fact, inbreeding was significantly associated with your risk of dying of some disease. So inbreeding in city populations may be more common. And if not more common, it may be more deadly because diseases are more likely to circulate among fairly concentrated populations. I will say that there's no such factors go into dying of West Nile virus. Almost every single crow that we know of has died of West Nile virus. We have one extant survivor, and that one survived only with the help of the wildlife clinic, and we can talk about that later. So what are some of the other problems that crows may face in the city? Well, as I said, they're generalist feeders, so there's lots of things for an adult crow to eat, as long as they're willing to eat our leftovers. But my former graduate student, Rebecca Heiss, did a study which even more strongly highlighted that what you can eat as an adult crow may not be the best thing for nestlings. And this Kevin had previously showed that there was a pattern where rural crows seemed to be larger than the urban nestlings that he was banding. And so we asked in both an observational study and also an experimental study where we supplemented the young crows in suburban areas, what could possibly be wrong with a diet of garbage? And in fact, what we found was that the rural crows, or compared to the rural crows, suburban crows had smaller broods. They were more likely to have a brood survive, but they had smaller broods, and their nestlings were smaller in almost every single measure, which means they weren't in worse condition. They weren't skinny. They were just small all over, but they were also lower in serum protein and serum calcium, and particularly low in serum calcium, which contributes to their bone growth, in areas that were like golf courses, which you would think would be great, but may well have had low calcium because they're rolled. It's hard to get in the ground. You can't get the kinds of prey that you think you can. So this raises one of these questions. If crows in urban areas are not able to give their nestlings the right kind of food, why are they choosing this bad food? I mean, they do have lawns and there are places to get normal food, shall we say. And we think that it probably stems in part from the fact that they live in the way they use cities. Actually, it makes them susceptible to ecological traps. That's when situations, either prey animals or actually habitat, looks good, even though it is actually bad. And you can appreciate that from the point of view of golf courses, which are made to look highly naturalistic, and yet between pesticides and rolled ground and fake water sources, they may not really harbor the kinds of prey that really will feed a young crow. So foraging rules may be really hard to change. You're supposed to get things that you recognize where to search, and you're supposed to get things that are fast and easy to deliver to the nest. And it may be hard to assess territory quality with these signals being mimicked by our wish for naturalistic appearances. So in other words, they're facing this novel problem. What's good for the adult in this case is not good for the nestlings. Some examples where these foods are easy, right? You can find pizza in your garbage can. This is the compost facility out at that's used by Cornell, and there's all kinds of human foods and dairy waste and that sort of thing going out there, as opposed to doing the kind of thing that they're supposed to do. And this is a crow in the fall eating beech nuts at a beech mast. And it was actually really fun because these beeches that would mast would produce a situation where crows from all the nearby territories would gather together in 30 or 40 or 50 of them in the beech trees. And they just had one heck of a good time, as far as I could tell. And we called them beech parties. So this finding that we have for the crows is really not different from what many people have found studying a variety of other birds that have moved into cities. There seems to be a general pattern, whether maybe made worse by bird feeders and human foods and other things that we do to our lawns, but there's a general pattern in which urban clutch sizes and nestling weights are often lower for urban than their rural counterparts. And there's even some evidence that nestlings may be experiencing stressors that will have effects on their chromosomes that may shorten their lives. Oops. Other little signs of things include these are fault bars that may be caused by periods of undernutrition, and these white feathers in their wings may also. The white feet, by the way, we thought maybe had to do with the same problems, but those turn out to be genetic, and I can trace it through a lineage or two in our crows. So now let's move quickly to thinking about ways in which crows have adapted to us in ecological time, that is, real time. I make my bread and butter, my students make their bread and butter because our crows are used to us. They come for peanuts. They know we feed peanuts. They know our cars, they know us. And so we've been really interested in, first of all, we use that because we can set up experiments at the side of the road and load them with peanuts. So I have a student who's been looking at whether or not they're lateralized. Do they prefer one foot over the other when they hold a peanut? You can set that up at the sides of the road. But in a broader sense, this gives us a reason to ask, well, it looks like our urban crows are pretty bold about coming close to our cars and coming up to our peanuts. Are they truly bolder than the rural crows? And have they made some specific adaptations to humans? And this comes to a critical question. One of the typical tests for boldness is to give them a novel object beside their food and then measure the time it takes for them to come to the food and ask, are you more or less neophobic? My graduate student, Dave Colucci, is taking this one step further and suggesting, well, maybe the kinds of things we offer urban crows as novel objects are simply not as novel to an urban crow as they are to a rural crow. As he titles his talks recently, it's only novel if you haven't seen it before. If you actually look at the literature, it's also a prediction that's not entirely well borne out by all of the tests of different species. So this is just summarizing that for a number of different species, urban urban birds may be less bold or less neophobic, less scared of novelty. They may not have any difference at all, or they may be more scared of novelty. And that's really an interesting point, because neophobia has its costs and benefits. It can protect an individual from harm, but if you're neophobic, if you're scared of new things, you're not going to discover anything new. And so we're trying to look at the American crow. So novelty is a function of experience, is his hypothesis. And he's tested now crows in urban and rural areas and produced a range of novelty for each one. Rocks should be familiar to everybody. In rural environments, corn's not so unfamiliar and probably more familiar than a fast food box. And then we have a base of a lampstand, which is supposed to be, it's shiny and supposed to be novel to everybody. In an urban environment, the food container is probably more familiar than an ear of corn. And what he's shown, and I'm not going to expect you to look too closely at the graph, is that, yes, in general, urban crows will come more quickly to a food where a novel object has been placed. But if you can look at the red bars, what you can see is that rural crows become more and more scared, that is, have a longer and longer bar, and that the middle bar moves down to fewer and fewer of them will feed as you get toward the most novel object. But they are less scared of the corn than they are of the box. And that the reverse is indeed true of our urban crows. So our urban crows are less scared of the box than they are of the corn. So both of them show this graded response to degree of familiarity. And so we think that in that sense, that the crows are in urban areas and rural areas, it's going to be really hard to compare them fairly in terms of understanding what's truly novel or not. Okay, I need to finish up here fairly quickly with 2 points. So this last little story, which I'm going to go through fast, is of something that's radically changed with our crows in urban areas. We all know that crows mob predators, and lots of crows will gather to get into it. And we also know that humans are still predators of crows. So this is from a crow shoot. Some 34 years ago, Knight et al. Showed that if you went to the nest of rural crows, they would start calling as soon as you started to approach the nest tree. They would be calling at the base of the nest, if you were at the base of the nest tree, but they would never dive at you. And they would always stay, if you look at the far right of the graph, they would always stay very far away from you. Whereas urban crows, even 34 years ago, gave much less notice if you were at the approaching, none, or at the tree base. But then if you actually went up to the nest, a good proportion would actually dive at you. And they were willing to go very close. So this difference in approach to humans had emerged very quickly as birds moved into urban areas. Every year since we've started, we've recorded the number of mobbers that go after the climber, whoever they are. And they don't necessarily attack, but they may bring in families from far around. So the number of mobbers can get quite large. And so we put all of that together across the years. And we found, first of all, if you look at the first 10 years, even in that first 10 years, we find that urban crows are indeed very likely to mob, and rural crows are less likely. They're more likely to stay farther away, out of gunshot range, perhaps. Urban crows, in fact, gather larger mobbing groups in those first 10 years. And more crows were willing to come in and take the risk of going after humans than was true for rural crows. So when we looked at our own mobbing data across a much larger span of years, all the way through 2013 and actually up to present, what we found was a very strange pattern. There was a sudden drop in the last 5 years of these 5-year blocks in the number of crows that were mobbing. And we, in fact, began the study because we had these instances. We went up to a tree and then there was nobody mobbing. And you'd look around and the owners of the nest would be 2 yards down watching you and wouldn't yell. So we looked more closely at this pattern across the years. And what all I really want you to notice is that the difference in these is really tied up in the fact that the last group of years, 2008 to 14, we had a large number, over about 15% of the nests that we visited, nobody mobbed at all. So what explains this? Are we looking at, we feed them peanuts? They can't imagine, how could we possibly harm their nestlings? I mean, this really does seem a little unlikely. And so we have to ask, what has really changed? We have one bird, MP Jessup, my 19-year-old female, where we had lots and lots and lots of data just from her. And we tested with her, we could test the idea that if you feed them peanuts and they learn to really like you and your peanuts, does that mean that they reduce their mobbing? And then you may be growing up in a family that never alarms at peanut tossing people, so you could have individual learning or cultural transmission. Well, MP Jessup actually never changed her tune. You get some drops in here that actually reflect, sadly, West Nile virus and fewer crows coming in to mob with her. But you can see she always mobbed, and she mobbed loud enough to bring in a good number of crows beside her and her mate. She never had a very big family. So even all across her years of eating peanuts, those last few years, she was scarfing peanuts until she started to sit on her nest. And then we went to the nest. She had no doubts. So I've looked at it also from this point of view. Mobbing benefits carry a cost. If you come in and mob, what you're doing is you're alerting every single predator around that you have a nest, and here it is, and there's another predator at it. So one of the questions I asked was, what about red-tailed hawks, which have also increasingly moved into town and are the subject of a great deal of crow mobbing, and also take crow nests and nestlings and even adults. And so if you look across this whole period, what you'll see is that the lines representing the Christmas bird counts of hawks are generally going up across our whole region. So I'm going to suggest that we may have some degree of a learned cultural shift in which crows familiar with us and our peanuts have reduced their responses to us. But it also might be that they recognize that they are now in a place with more crow predation, and they're downgrading their responses to the degree of predatory threat. They're sort of balancing humans versus advertising the nest to a hawk. So the last point, and I realize I'm pushing time, I'm sorry because of the little bit of getting started, but let me just quickly run through my little conservation message. You probably know that there's lots of crows worldwide, all of them big crows and ravens, big black birds, Corvus, the genus Corvus, a few of them with white or gray in various parts. Many of them of these are sprinkled around in the ocean, you see, and that means that they're living on islands. A good number of those species do live in association with humans, so they can adapt. And here's just some wonderful Corvus heads from a very old 1926 sketchbook. And what you can see is how wonderfully variable they actually are. They may be all big black birds, but their bills and their head shapes, not to speak of their feet and a few other things, are amazingly diverse. Here's one for you, Corvus crassirostris, and a few others. on the right is Hawaiiensis and Kubari, the Mariana Crow. So one of my students, Andrea Kroner, and I, with some undergraduates, started to look for what do we know across the world of crows about Corvus sociality. And it turns out you can make a nice taxonomy. There's crows for whom they, like our crows, they have year-round territoriality of stable pairs. And the immatures either go nomadic and flock like ravens, or the immatures and non-breeders stay on the natal territory with possible cooperative breeding. That would be American crows. The other pattern is that they spend their time in flocks, breeders and non-breeders flocking. And then seasonally, the pairs establish individual breeding territories seasonally, or like rooks, they establish a shared breeding territory and breed communally. So you have this really interesting array of different social structures. Fish crows, being studied by my student Connor Loomis in Ithaca, who are living with American crows. You can see the bunch down there in the bottom are scratching each other. They live in social flocks, except for the very small period in which they establish breeding territories, raise their young, and as soon as the young can fly, they leave and rejoin their little flocks. So crows overall are wonderfully diverse in ways in which you can say, okay, we have a big black bird, and yet it's socially different. There's morphology differences in the beak, and there's behavioral diversity. So there's all kinds of things you could study having to do with what little aspects of their habitat, the competition with other birds, the food available, et cetera, can lead to different degrees of tool use, cultural transmission, cooperative breeding versus flock breeding, et cetera. You all know, just as a quick example, you know the New Caledonian Crow, which is famous for its making of tools on the island of New Caledonia and the nearby islands of Mare. And the story seems to be that they're on an island without woodpeckers. There's these huge grubs that you can't get any other way, and they've evolved to actually not only mentally know how to get those grubs out and make the tools that they stick down in the holes to get them, but their beaks have been adapted until they look kind of like pliers to hold those tools straight down. And their eyes have rotated forward so they can look down the tool. So we took a look then at what is the status of all of these different species. And what we found is that most Corvus species, if you look at the IUCN, are not raising any level of concern. 35 of the 46 are listed as least concern. There are 5 near threatened and vulnerable. The endangered, critically endangered, that includes the Mariana Crow that I'll show you in a moment. And then, of course, we have the Hawaiian Crow, which is extinct in the wild, but has been recently reintroduced. So it doesn't look like most crows are in trouble. But then we started to look on what do we know about their populations? And I won't belabor you to look closely at this, but basically almost all of the reports, except for about 6 species, most all of the reports on social structure and population have to do with unquantified reports, many of them way older than 10 years old. Madge and Burns up here is a famous book that is a field guide, and it's cited more than anything else as evidence that they're fine. And we broke it down to say, how many studies of behavior are there? And what you can see is 36% of these crows have 0 studies of behavior. Another 19% has 1 to 2. Anything with more than 10 studies, 24% of all the crows. And most scary is the number of crows where we have no data that are island species. And island species exist at very low population sizes by definition. And they're the ones that if people are moving in on the island, those crows could go extinct without our even knowing. And most of those have no data whatsoever. This is just a quick example from some of my grad students' work. Macrorhynchus is a species that listed of no concern. This is their extent. Anybody looking at that map should say, wait a minute, you mean those crows down on Indonesia, they're not different than the ones that are living up in northern Mongolia? And my student Aubrey Lamshaw is studying the Levante. It's one of the jungle crows, large-billed crows in Thailand, and trying to investigate how different they may be from the larger group of crows of large-billed crows that have been described. Another is one of the critically endangered. I have 2 students who have been working with the aga, the Mariana Crow, on the little island of Rota. And basically so little has been known about them. She's studying vocalizations. Henry has been looking at their parasites and their social networks, in an effort to basically save this crow, which has about 220 birds left in the world. They used to be on Guam, no longer because of the brown tree snake. They're only on Rota, an island 16 kilometers long. So, lesson ignored. Well, we have Hawaiian crows that were allowed to go extinct in the wild, Mariana crows, critically endangered, New Caledonian crows. They're uniquely cultural, but there's not a lot of them. There's just one island. Cuban crow, this is one that Kevin took. I mean, we don't know much about them. That looks strange. And basically, I think it boils down to threatened Corvus species and vulnerable island species are our least known in every single way, having to do with population, social behavior, cognition, culture, and even our chance of losing them. And with that, I want to just close with one little shout out to the Ross Park Zoo, which may, if I work with them, have some sort of Asian crow at some point, but they are about to put in a new Birds of Asia aviary coming in the spring of 2022, in which they want to emphasize the culture of Asia and the birds of Asia, and it will be built down in the bottom of the zoo. It'll be easy to get to, a brand new aviary, and please go on and support it if you possibly can. And with that, thanks everybody, from me and from all the members of the Crow Research Group who have helped and bring you with this I'm now too long talk. Thank you.
Anne, there have been a few questions that have been raised during your talk. The first one is whether there's been any exchange between the deep urban crows and the rural crows that you know of. And do you know about the content of these exchanges?
Exchanges as in like moving back and forth and breeding in different areas? Or maybe they could clarify.
This person just said exchanges, and we don't, whatever
okay.
You might think of.
Sure. First of all, we're asking, one of the things that my student who's studying the boldness is also asking is whether there's any genetic differences, like are they cut off and urban crows breed with urban crows and rural crows breed with rural crows? Yeah?
This person has clarified, and he said that he meant behavioral and cultural exchanges.
They have opportunities, and I suspect they do. So what we know at this point is that rural crows tend to stay rural. In other words, I don't see rural crows that we've now marked showing up in town breeding. So they're not bringing their rural knowledge into town. And urban crows in general don't just go outside and breed in a very rural area. And they also sometimes leapfrog. So we have Ithaca crows who leapfrog and show up in Cortland as if they're traveling over rural areas to a similar urban spot. That said, at this time of year, all bets are off. They are out of their territories. They are slopping all over upstate New York. They are going up to Auburn and sleeping together. And this is where I'm helping. I and a colleague are rewriting the Birds of North America, which is now Birds of the World account. And she says, we've got to tell people how little we know about their social lives, because these birds are out there in flocks of 65,000 birds. And I'm sure that it's a mix of rural, urban, Canadian, New Hampshire, New York. I mean, what do they say? Maybe they can tell where they come from by how they sound. We don't know.
Another listener asks, how do you determine the sex of the study crows?
Several different ways. The most, when we get them as nestlings or if we get them in hand, we take a blood sample and we do it genetically. Because if I have two crows and I know they're a pair, I can probably make a pretty good guess as to which is the male and which is the female. Males are a little larger, their bills are a little heavier. In breeding season, they drop their belly feathers and they swagger. And of course, if somebody sits on a nest, then you know. Only the females incubate. And that might not be true with all crow species, by the way. That's something that seems to be completely not known for many of them. But the really only sure way is genetic sex. And our crows, so everybody probably knows, but the Northwestern crow is just put together with the American crow again. So we lost a species. So the Northwestern crow had been separated as a species, and now is such a jumble of genetics. It looks like there were periods thousands of years ago and it was pretty separate, and then they've come together and they've interbred, and there's this Seattle's a mess. But those crows are small, they're little. And so if you went there, you would not probably feel so confident coming from our crows as to which was a female and which was a male. So if anybody tells you they know for sure, yeah, maybe.
There was another question related to food when you were talking about crows eating. And the question is, how do crows decide what to eat? For example, are there experiments where the crows are given a choice of what to eat, and what do they choose? And is there some logic that seems to be, or what?
They really do like meat. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting is how many people firmly believe that what the crows are really fascinated by out in a cornfield that's just been cut is little bits of actual corn. That's given them their first ability to get down and get grubs and things in the soil from the base of the corn. They love big, meaty grubs and big insects. And you'll see them chasing grasshoppers. So I think one of the things that they do is they are aware of some of the things that are really high quality food. They're also influenced by size. So when we feed them peanuts and they're stacking peanuts in their bills, they can carry like 6 or 8 peanuts in a bill. They put it underneath in their pouch, in their sublingual pouch, and then they'll stack them. And I've seen crows go along and they've stacked a bunch in, and then they come to a peanut that's like that big, and they drop everything and restack everything, and they leave a little one. So they're not stupid about size. And some of the Japanese folks who are studying large-billed crows have shown that they're also very good with numbers. So they can make good number judgments. So if you had 2 over here and 4 over there, they'd probably know which to go to.
What about with relation to mobbing? Are there actual mobbing calls that other crows recognize?
Yeah, well, yes. And do we know all about them? No, but most people are probably who've paid attention to crows are probably aware of how you know that they're after a hawk. And some of that is the loudness, the forcedness of a caw. And it also some comes from, they're diving. And I think some of that changes the way the call sounds. But we have showed that we've been doing some studies of vocalizations I didn't talk about, but one of my students showed that if you, there's a short call like caw, caw, and that can be, it's not a mobbing call, but it's given often when you walk up suddenly on a bunch of crows and somebody flies up and it goes caw, caw, and the whole family goes up. But we feeding peanuts, we kept thinking, we hear this caw, caw, and we can tell that that's I'm sitting on the wire and I see peanuts. Hey, everybody come over. It's a caw, caw, woo, it's something good. And so we thought that we could tell the difference. Kevin told us, Kevin would not believe me, but I mean, the difference is subtle. And I know that he can tell the difference if he thinks about it, but we did the sonographs and we did the sound spectrographs, right? And the difference is exactly as you might think. It's the duration of the call, slight difference, and a slight frequency difference. But it's all the world of difference in meaning between, oh my, watch out, something's come, get up out of the ground, or hey, look, there's peanuts. And it's, it's a little bit like you saying, hey, shush, everybody, there's a boogeyman. And hey, look at what's here.
One last question that came up has to do with food and familiarity. The person wonders, will crows come to humans and take food? Just like, for example, chickadees will come to your hand and take food. Will crows do that?
I'm sure that some people can get them, would get them to do that ultimately. I think there's at least a few people on the call who've tried. But as most of us know, it's really true. And this is the thing about our sort of being doubtful about urban crows being bold. It's more that they are very good at assessing the situation and their risk. And I have never had a crow I had one crow almost fly into my car, but she and I, neither one of us realized how close she was. And she was like, oh my God, because I was throwing peanuts out of the window and I had the door slightly open and, we both made that mistake. So my answer is, I think they'd be really, really reluctant. One of the things that is interesting, and I think it's fun to think about, there's studies that show how much body size influences how fast you can take off. And so, geese fly away from you at a much greater distance because it takes them forever to get off the ground. And a chickadee will come up and land on your hand. A hummingbird will be here, right? You're not going to catch that hummingbird.
Right.
But if a crow comes up, he can only be as safe as they are by staying at a further distance. And our fish crows are 2/3 the size of an American crow. And if you put out something and expect a crow to land on it, the fish crows will be the first ones because they can lift right off. So I think they balance risk, and it has to do with their ability to get away. So never expect a hummingbird or a chickadee to, behavior on the part of a crow.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Anne. It was a great presentation. I feel like I learned a lot.
Sorry, it was so fast.
No, you were fine. I did want to mention, I'm going to put in the chat section about the Ross Zoo and the aviary. Anne has very generously donated her speaker fee for this evening to be sent to the Ross Zoo in support of building that new aviary for Asian birds. So I have linked.
Oops. You muted.
You're muted, Susan.
Yeah, I hit the space bar, or
I did
yeah,
that once.
I hit the space bar by accident. So I just posted that in the chat window,
Great.
the link for the donations at the Ross Zoo. And I couldn't find anything that was specific to the aviary, but you probably will have the option to send a message to say, you know, I'd like my donation to be used towards this, if anybody's interested in doing that.
Yeah, it's very new. So they've just decided to go with that as a priority, a priority development. So if you just put it down, I'm sure it'll be at their website at some point. But yep, that's great.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate that. We appreciate your time tonight and just all of this great information. So,
well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I wish I could see everybody.
I know, in person sometime soon.